Hello everyone, this is the second video of security testing series. In the first video we discussed different terms related to security testing and the purpose of security testing. If you have not yet watched that video, you can find the link in the description below. I will also put the link of that video in the icon above. Talking about this video, then we are going to learn about different phases of security testing and also learn about the approaches to security testing. So without further delay, let's get started. These are the phases of security testing. We have scoping, reconnaissance, vulnerability scanning, exploitation, and reporting. We are going to discuss each of them in detail. So starting with the first term, which is scoping. In this phase, we decide the scope of our VAPT. What all things do we have to consider or include in our assessment? If our target application has certain subdomains, then do we have to consider them? Or is it just going to be the main domain or the main side? Do we have to consider the dev or QA or staging environment? Or is it just the production application or the production environment that we are going to test? If there are certain third party plugins, then do we have to test it or like they are out of scope? Are there any features that we are not supposed to test? For example, payment feature. The client might ask us not to test payment feature for like whatever reason. It's also possible that a target application might have the uh, web application. It might have a mobile application. Then in the mobile application, there is an Android application, iOS application. So like, do we have to consider all of them, or like is it like only the web application is in scope and mobile application is out of scope? So everything is like decided or finalized in this particular phase. So this phase is like the preparatory stage. Actual work start from the next phase, which is the reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is basically a military term, which means to observe the region to either locate an enemy or ascertain some strategy. Here, the enemy is the vulnerabilities present in an application. Like we try to gather as much information as we can about the application, be it subdomains or IP addresses or port numbers, open ports, and the services running on them. Like the more time we spend in this particular phase in the reconnaissance, the better it is for us because we will have a like larger attack surface. There are different techniques of performing this particular activity. Like we have subdomain enumeration, port enumeration, content discovery, and similarly we also have like many tools like Nmap, WFIRST, Sublister, or NockBuy. In the coming videos, we are going to cover all of these tools. So if you have yet not subscribed to this channel, then please do it now and hit the bell icon so you get the notification of new videos. Now, once we have gathered the information, we proceed toward the next phase, which is the vulnerability scanning. In this particular phase, we find out the loopholes or the weaknesses present in the application, and it's quite evident from the name of this phase as well, which is the vulnerability scanning. Like we look for vulnerability in each and every subdomain or the IP addresses and the ports which are open and the services running on them, like everything which is in scope. In this phase, also we do make use of certain tools like Niktoiz, which is a vulnerability scanning. And if we are dealing with a WordPress site, then we can make use of WP scan tool. Like this Nikto, WP scan, they are all open source tools. If we have to scan for SQL injection vulnerabilities, then we can make use of SQL map tool. Like, however, we must not blindly believe the findings of these tools because they can be false positive or false negative. For example, Nikto tool might say that there exists cross-site scripting in an application because it is using a vulnerable version of the server. But there could be checks in place and the vulnerability might not actually exist. So when such a thing happens where a tool reports a particular vulnerability, but that vulnerability actually doesn't exist, then it is known as the false positive. And there can be a situation where a tool like SQL Map might say there is no SQL injection present. Okay, it might say that there is no SQL injection vulnerability present, but it might not be true, and there can be a SQL injection vulnerability present in the application. So when this happens, that a tool doesn't report any vulnerability which actually exists in the application, then it is known as the false negative. So the only way to like strike out or find out whether it's a false positive or false negative is the manual intervention that actually we do in the next phase, which is the exploitation. Exploitation is the phase where the actual attack happens. We actually work to find out whether the vulnerabilities reported by these tools actually exist or not. We can also say that this is the phase where the actual damage is done to the application which is under the assessment. So the idea is to perform this entire activity of security testing on an environment which is the exact replica of the production environment. Also, the environment must be exclusively used by the security testing team, and it must not be shared with the QA team. It should not be the case that a QA team is also performing testing on it, and the development is happening. Development team is doing build deployments on it. So all these things might hamper the assessment results. But there can be a case. I mean, some clients might insist on getting the testing done in a production environment. So you can do this activity in a production environment, although it's not preferred, but you can do this activity on a production environment, but it should be done only when the traffic is low, so that other users are not affected who are actually using this application. And you must have a proper backup of the everything. So in case anything goes wrong, you ran some script and anything goes wrong, a backup can be taken. So that's why you have to be very extra you have to be extra cautious of the payloads that you are going to use, because you might not know what the consequences will be. I mean, if there actually exists a vulnerability and that payload get executed, then that execution might impact the actual users of the application. So you have to be very cautious with the payloads that you use. So here in this particular phase, the weightage must be given to the manual techniques rather than relying on tools, like as we have already discussed in case of vulnerability scanning. Now, once we have found which is we have removed the false positive and false negative, then comes the part of reporting, which is the next phase, where we document our findings. We mention the vulnerabilities that we have found along with the description. We also specify the risks associated with all those vulnerabilities. And we make use of CVSS calculator, which we covered in the last video, to specify the severity. We also provide the steps to exploit the particular vulnerability that we have found with proper screenshots and wherever necessary. So not only this, but we also recommend remediation for these vulnerabilities. I mean, it's unlike what we do in testing, we just point out that this particular functionality is not working properly. I mean, the expected behavior is this, but actual behavior is this. But in case of security testing, we have to specify the remediation. For example, if there exists a SQL injection vulnerability, then what actually needs to be done? If there exists a cross-site scripting vulnerability, then what needs to be done? So we have to tell what needs, how this particular vulnerability can be remediated. So these were the phases of security testing, but how things will proceed and where we will spend more time depends upon the approach that is being followed. So this brings us to security testing approaches. There are different security testing approach. We have black box, we have white box, and we have gray box approach. So talking about the black box approach, then it is similar to an attack carried by an external threat, like some hacker trying to break into the system or an application. In this approach, the client or the application owner might reach out for getting the security testing done and won't share any information with you. So you have to spend a lot of time in reconnaissance and gather as much information as you can about the client so that you have a greater attack surface before you actually start with the security testing. So this approach is very time consuming. Now the next approach, which is the white approach, is the exact opposite of the black box approach. I mean, that's very much evident from their name as well. So in this approach, that is the white box approach, the client shares each and every detail with you. They might give you access to their code repository for code review from security point of view. They might share different users of all the roles for testing. Basically, you have the complete system information with you. Usually, this approach is followed before going live for testing some specific scenarios like SQL injection or cross-site scripting or some other specific vulnerability. If some specific vulnerability is being tested, then there is no need for scoping or reconnaissance. Now, there is an approach which is in between these approaches and is known as the gray box approach. This approach can be used to demonstrate or showcase both the scenarios where the attack is carried out by an insider threat and the one carried out by an outside threat. So this is the most followed approach. You are shared with the limited information about the application like credentials or URLs which are in scope. So this approach showcases the scenario where any privileged user or the user having access to the application carries out some attack. In this approach, there is no need to spend much time on reconnaissance activity because whatever needs to be tested, that information is already shared with the security testing team. So that's pretty much for all this video. In the next video, we will cover different tools that we use during different phases of security testing. So till then, goodbye and happy learning.